I want to speak for a few minutes today about something that touches my heart very deeply, and I imagine touches many people in this room very deeply. And I'm going to start by bringing us to the very first line of this week's Torah portion, Chayei Sarah. It says, as Rabbi Kasher pointed out earlier, Vayiyu Chayei Sarah, and it was that the life of Sarah, 100 shana ve'esrim shana ve'sheva shanim, Shnei Chayei Sarah. It's incredibly redundant. You can hear it even in the Hebrew, even if you don't understand it. In English, it says that Sarah's lifetime, the span of her life, came to 100 years and 20 years and 7 years. Those were the years of Sarah's life. So the question that many people ask over the course of thousands of years is this: why is the Torah that is so scant with words speaking in such a redundant and seemingly superfluous way here? Now, our rabbinic tradition says that you can't take anything for granted here, that there's meaning in everything. And we're famously told by Rashi and others, and this is drawn from the Midrash, that the word shana, the word year, is repeated as a reflection of endearment for our matriarch Sarah. That she was, even in her old age, as sin-free as she was when she was in her 20s and when she was in her as a youth. We also learn that the word year is shana. It's repeated in the Torah here to teach us that every single year of Sarah's life was a good year, a reflection of her righteousness, of her decency, and of her goodness in the world. That's powerful. That's a powerful idea. And so it's really lovely and it's really poetic that the Parsha ends the same way that it starts, with somebody else who dies, and that person's years are also enumerated in much the same way. 100 shana u'shloshim shana v'sheva shanim. That person is Yishmael. And it seems like it's saying that Yishmael, too, based on our interpretation of Sarah, was good, and he was righteous, and he lived with integrity, and he was sin-free all the years of his life. If we apply the same hermeneutics to the end of the Torah portion that we applied to the beginning, we would have to come to that conclusion. So let's just take a step back to make sure everyone knows who the players are in this story. Yishmael was born to Avraham, a man who was promised by God that he would be a father of great nations, but seemed to be infertile. Or maybe it was that his wife Sarah was infertile. In order to figure that out, Sarah encourages Avraham to sleep with Hagar, her handmaid. And miracle of miracles, Avraham, already an old man, finally has a child. And that child's name is Yishmael. God will hear, right? But this kid, Yishmael, he's a bad apple. When he's an adolescent, you might remember the story, Sarah learns that she's able to have a child after all, and that brand new baby, our ancestor Yitzchak, that brand new baby is found when Yishmael is mitzachek with him. He's playing with him. And we don't know exactly what Yishmael is doing with this baby, but we know that it's something really bad because the Torah tells us that Sarah is so upset about it that essentially she demands of Avraham, you have to get rid of this kid. I don't want him in the house with my child. And for thousands of years, the commentators try to parse out what was he doing to this baby? What does it mean that he was mitzachek, that Yishmael was mitzachek with Yitzchak? And they come up with all kinds of terrible interpretations. If you read your Parsha Nut last week, you can see that Rabbi Kasher articulates what many of them are. Rashi and others say that basically he did one of the big three. He either committed idolatry, or he tried to commit murder, or he committed sexual violence against Yitzchak. Whichever one it is, they're all rotten. Or maybe other people say he mocked and he ridiculed his brother. Or maybe he was just trying to cheat Yitzchak out of his inheritance. However you slice it, it doesn't look good for Ishmael, right? A wild ass of a man, he's called in Genesis chapter 16. Nothing at all like our ancestor Yitzchak, who is pious and he's humble and he's unassuming. Ishmael was a troubled kid who grows up to be a troubled adult. So then how can the honorific that Sarah gets, the honorific of years and years and years, be assigned to a man who at best was trying to cheat his brother out of his inheritance. At worst, really engaged in vile acts of violence against him. No, the rabbis say. We don't have to apply the interpretation of Sarah to the story of Yishmael. We don't have to have the same rules apply that we just told you moments ago is the way that we understand the Torah. The Torah is definitely not trying to honor the evil Ishmael. Definitely not trying to claim that this man is righteous. If anything, the language was only used in order to honor Avraham because he was still a son of Avraham, even though he turned out to be pretty rotten himself. Okay. There's only, well, there are many problems here, but there's one big problem here, which is all of those stories that we tell about Yishmael being so violent and so evil, the Torah does not actually say those things. The rabbis say those things. What the Torah actually says is that Yishmael was playing with his brother, something that we might even encourage among siblings. It's the rabbis who interpret the violence and the cruelty. And in fact, if you dig deeply enough, you're going to find hints of another Yishmael in our tradition, but only hints. Maybe the real Yishmael that are scattered throughout the rabbinic tradition. Rabbi Kasher brought this text this week in his Parsha class. Ramban indicates that in fact Yishmael was righteous, that he was a man of repentance, and that's why the Torah wants to honor him the same way that Sarah was honored. Or maybe you'll hear another story, a midrash that comes from Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, which is an 8th century compilation of midrashim. This is a story of Avraham missing his son Yishmael so badly after he sent him away that he would venture again and again out into the desert just trying to reconnect with his beloved son. And Yishmael, with his big heart, who ultimately realizes that his father still loves him and decides to forgive him. Or maybe you'll notice, if you're looking for it, that after Avraham dies, in this week's parsha, we see that Avraham's sons, Yitzchak and Yishmael, bury him together in the cave of Machpelah. That detail, that ought to catch our attention. How did it happen that these two brothers, Yitzchak and Yishmael, who've been estranged for a whole lifetime, are able to stand together and bury their father, our ancestor Yitzchak and Yishmael? If you dig, you'll see that Yitzchak, after almost being murdered by Avraham on the mountain in last week's parsha, he actually sought out his brother, maybe to apologize, maybe to share trauma, definitely to start to heal. Again, we see hints of tenderness and open-heartedness and righteousness in Yishmael. And even still, the stories of his evil are foundational tales. Ask any third grader, and you'll hear Yishmael, he was the evil one. Yitzchak, he was the good one. We pass down these stories lador vador, folks, from one generation to the next. But I want us to realize this morning that this is a choice, that we're choosing to tell the story of a person who could have been seen as righteous instead as evil. And that story is such a powerful story that it places the weight of the tradition on the side of Yishmael's evil, even if that evil was made up in the first place. As a result, what happens to Yishmael is that he suffers from multi-generational confirmation bias. Multi-generational confirmation bias. Some of you read Daniel Kahneman. He writes about this. The confirmation bias is the intrinsic desire to seek out evidence that will support beliefs and assumptions that we already hold. I have to tell you, if we think that we are objective observers of the world, it is not true. We all operate with confirmation bias. If you see Yishmael as the ancestor of your enemy, then you will read a story about him being mitzachek as evidence of his abject immorality. Inversely, there's this thing called the halo effect, which is if we like someone, we're likely to see them more sympathetically. It's harder for us to believe that they've done something that's bad or that's wrong. And this kind of thinking, which we all do, makes it really difficult for us to integrate or even hear information that challenges our assumptions about a person or about a people. The danger here is that our confirmation biases lead us to establish sometimes long-standing narrative fallacies. These narrative fallacies are flawed stories that tell us a story about the past and paint a vision of the world and helps set our expectations about the future. So when we project on Ishmael generation after generation stories of heartlessness and cruelty and violence, we are building ourselves an archetypal enemy. So this is the heart of the problem. Once a narrative is created, our confirmation bias will provide us with endless proof texts that will reinforce even the faultiest of assumptions. And maybe you can guess why I'm so interested in this idea this week. Because confirmation biases and narrative fallacies don't only exist in ancient rabbinic interpretations, but they're also all too prevalent in our culture and our society today. And they're not only inconvenient. In certain climates, they can become downright dangerous, especially when you live like we do in a broader political culture of violent extremism. Antisemitism, they say, is one of the oldest and the most dangerous of the narrative fallacies. Like the tradition's response to Ishmael, antisemitism is rooted in several dangerous false narratives, lies that are so deeply embedded in the collective conscience that even Jews sometimes struggle to identify and to understand why these lies are so damaging. So I want to take a couple of minutes with you to just deconstruct some of these false narratives. Anti-Semitism is a conspiracy theory. It is a myth about Jewish power, and it manifests in many ways, 3 of them most significantly today. This is the myth of Jews running the media, the myth of Jews running the banks, and the myth of Jews running government. And here's why those myths are so dangerous. I want to break it down for us. Jews control the media. So first of all, let me say that it is true that there are many Jews in Hollywood. Some of my closest friends and my husband are Jews in Hollywood. And there are some really good reasons why historically Jews flocked to this industry. Some of them have to do with Eastern European Jewish immigrants being excluded from other more respectable industries. But the idea that there is a Jewish cabal that is controlling or striving to control media is a lie. And it's a dangerous lie. I'll tell you why. Because it implies that Jews control our society's public messaging, that Jews shape the public narrative, that Jews control or strive to control what people think. Jews control the banks. Well, it is true that throughout history, Jews were sometimes money lenders and tax collectors. And as many of us know, that is largely because we were prohibited from owning land and restricted from other occupations. It's also true that there are some Jews who have acquired tremendous wealth in this country in our time. Some of them, not all of them. It might surprise you to know that nearly 20% of American Jewish households earn less than $30,000 a year. 20% of American Jewish households earn less than $30,000 a year. And a significant percentage of those earn less than $15,000 a year. Tropes like Soros and the Rothschilds run the economy are lies. And these are dangerous lies because they offer people in distress, people who are struggling financially, an easy answer. If you're struggling, it's because the system is rigged. It's because there is a nefarious group that controls the levers of our financial systems and reap the benefit themselves of those systems while you and your loved ones, good, hardworking people, suffer the consequences. Finally, Jews control the government. Here I'd like to say that yes, it is true that you will find some Jews serving in the government in the United States. Some of my closest friends are the Jewish mayor of Los Angeles. Jews represent about 7% of Congress. This is more than our proportion in the population, but this is hardly a critical mass. And this too is a lie. It is a dangerous lie that hints that Jews are puppet masters who are secretly and selfishly controlling the country and controlling the world. Jews control the media, Jews control the banks, Jews control government. And we haven't even touched upon, and will not touch today, upon perhaps the greatest lie of all, that the Jews killed God. But certainly you can imagine the composite picture that is formed by these particular lies, that Jews are a nefarious force within our society, a fifth column that either has or strives for world domination. And maybe if there hadn't been a mass genocide of our people in living memory, we could take the joke. Maybe we could take these ideas as harmless tropes, but we know how intoxicating these ideas are. We've been through history, and we understand how these ideas become normalized in a society and in a culture until they ultimately endanger the lives of Jews. And we've seen that process of normalization taking place here in the United States over the past several years. This story did not start last Saturday night with a monologue set on a stage before millions of people. This didn't start when some iconic cultural figures in the course of the last month or the former president repeatedly mouthed off about the Jews in the last month and a half. The tipping point in anti-Semitism in America was in 2017, in Charlottesville, when two critical things happened at once. First, the public was introduced to the idea that Jews will not replace us, a painful awakening to the centrality of anti-Semitism in white nationalism, especially as it manifests in the Great Replacement theory. This is a way to explain Black excellence by claiming that Jews are puppet masters behind movements for racial justice. Anti-Semitism, we have learned, is the beating heart of white nationalism and white supremacist ideology. Again and again, I will beg you, if you have not yet read Eric Ward, you must read Eric Ward. The second thing that happened was the President of the United States equivocated before Nazis marching on U.S. soil and murdering a person. And that was, in the words of the white nationalist leaders, the single greatest day for white nationalists in U.S. history. That was in 2017. This is a dangerous and a toxic brew. So anything in our broader culture that feeds these conspiracy theories, whether it comes from a nightly TV anchor or from our college campuses, from the right or from the left, whether it comes from a pundit or even from a well-told, seemingly innocuous monologue, all of it has to be taken seriously. It's not funny. It's not funny and it's not courageous to regurgitate Nazi and white nationalist talking points. That's not speaking truth to power. That is becoming the unwitting mouthpiece of white power. It doesn't take a PhD in racism to understand why these lies are dangerous for the Jews. We've seen the statistics and we've heard about these violent incidents and physical assaults against Jews, desecration of Jewish spaces and threats to our schools and synagogues and community centers. 63% of all religiously motivated violent extremism in our country right now is motivated by anti-Semitism. Jews are 2% of the population. 63% of the hate crimes are against Jews. But what might be less obvious to us is who else is endangered by these lies. Anti-Semitism is not only a threat to the Jews, it's a bellwether of the health of a society. Because when anti-Semitism thrives, racism thrives. When anti-Semitic language proliferates, when you see swastikas on trailers outside of day schools, it's not just the Jews who are unsafe. Everybody is unsafe. Because when violence against Jews is normalized, there's an increase in violence generally, especially against other vulnerable minority communities. Anti-Semitism drives a wedge in our movements for justice, especially between Black and Jewish communities, one that puts our Black Jewish family in a particularly and doubly precarious position. The anti-Semitic lie endangers not only Jews, it endangers our democracy. And I say this today because this is an era of truth-telling. It's a time of contemplation and interrogation, a time of relearning. Ibram X. Kendi writes that the only way to undo racism is to consistently identify and to describe it and then to dismantle it. That's the work that we all have to take so seriously. We have to do that work when it comes to dismantling anti-Black racism, in addition to all the other phobias and bigotries, and we have to do that work as a society when it comes to anti-Semitism. Because even though people talk about anti-Semitism as one of the world's oldest hatreds, it does not have to be a permanent feature of our society. We can cleanse even very old narrative fallacies and start over. We're doing that today with Yishmael. After more than 2,000 years of villainizing this guy, today we can choose to see him as an open-hearted, forgiving, stand-up guy. We all have the power to break the chain, to recast old stories in a new, healthy, clean way. So here's the narrative that I'm choosing to tell today about Parshat Chayei Sarah. Thousands of years ago, two brothers stood together at the graveside, and they buried a father who had jeopardized both of their lives and had caused them both terrible pain. One of them, the older, had been banished from his home in order to protect the younger. Over many years, the older son was criminalized, neglected, discounted. He and his mother nearly died many times, but he survived. And years later, he found in his heart forgiveness. First, he forgave his little brother, the one who benefited most from the cruelties that were visited upon him. Then he turned his open heart toward his father. His presence at the grave that day was an act of love and an expression of grace, a model for all of us that reconciliation is possible and that a different kind of future is possible. If he could learn that lesson, could not we all? I wish you Shabbat Shalom.